Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Terrific. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the MSR Visiting Speaker Series. Before we get started, let me make a few notes. First of all, thank you, Amy Graves and Michelle Reagan-Ransom, for organizing this event. We've got a great speaker today, so I'm really looking forward to that. Also, I wanted to make a note. My name is Ryan Brush. I work in GFS, Global Foundation Services for Microsoft, but I also teach at University of Washington. So what's fun about this is I'm actually going to use part of the book that you see in the back as a textbook for this upcoming semester. So from October through June, we offer a data analysis certificate program through University of Washington. And this is basically in the evenings, Mondays and Thursdays. If any of you are interested in learning more about the program, please feel free to reach out. Be happy to share details about that. So as we get started, let me read the short blip about John Foreman. So John Foreman, he's the chief data scientist for MailChimp.com, where he leads a data science product development effort called the Email Genome Project. As an analytics consultant, John has created data science solutions for the Coca-Cola Company, Royal Caribbean International, Intercontinental Hotels Group, and the Department of Defense, the IRS, and the FBI. So John's book, Data Smart, Using Data Science to Transform Information into Insight, is now out from Wiley, and it's possibly the most legal fun you can have with spreadsheets. So looking forward to today's session, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to John. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So I'm John, and appreciate the introduction, Ryan. Like Ryan said, I am a recovering consultant. That was all those projects he listed off was when I was a consultant in a management consulting firm. Also, before this talk, I had a huge lunch over near Building 99, so I'm just going to be burping through the entire talk, so that'll just happen. I'll try to keep it quiet, but the food was delicious. And I'm an operations research guy. So operations research is math applied to decision making, and it's kind of a piece of data science before data science was sexy, right? Operations research has been around for a long time, since World War II, looking at how do we schedule convoys, things like that. So it's an analytics practice that's been around for a very long time. But I left management consulting and went to MailChimp. So I don't know how many of y'all know what MailChimp is or use MailChimp, but it is the world's largest. I see a thumbs up in the back there. Someone use MailChimp? Yes. So it's the world's largest email service provider. So MailChimp is a website through which you would upload your email list and create a newsletter to send to that list. And we'd help you do that and help you track opens, clicks, e-commerce transactions that started in that newsletter. So we send about 10 billion emails every month, and then we track a bunch of interactions with those emails. And so there's another 4 billion interactions coming in, opens, clicks, unsubscribes, abuse reports, all that kind of stuff. We actually send a lot to Hotmail, so y'all get a lot of email from us. We have about 280 employees in Atlanta, so we're all in the South. That's why I say y'all. You'll get used to it by the end of this talk. So I was a math guy and was used to working with large organizations before coming to MailChimp. And so my experience doing analytics was always that there would be this other analytics team I'd be working with, and everyone would be analytics all the time. And when I went to a startup, it was kind of weird. I met Greg. Greg is a designer at MailChimp. And then I met Fabio, email template designer. Mardav is a designer. And I met Dave, designer. Caleb, designer. Jen, designer. This is Justin, our t-shirt designer. He designs t-shirts like this and like that shirt. They make things like this billboard outside of our headquarters. This is the death metal billboard. It was eventually replaced with an 80s metal billboard. And these are our action figures for Freddie, our mascot, or vinyl figures. And so this became immediately very confusing for me. I met Aaron, who's our head of UX. He's a very famous designer, wrote a book called Designing for Emotion. And this is Ben, our CEO, a man of many talents. He also has a design background. And very quickly I realized that most companies are not in the business of analytics, right? When you hear about data science and analytics these days, the same companies are in the headlines. A lot of it seems to have to do with tracking personal data and doing ad targeting. I was going to a company that did not do that, right? They had some other product that people paid monthly fees for to use our product. What does analytics look like there? What I quickly realized was that all these people, all these designers, they were after one goal, right? They wanted to improve the product by improving the user's experience of that product. So what I realized is if I'm going to do analytics at MailChimp, I'm going to have to get behind this, right? This is the goal of everyone I kept encountering. So what does that look like for me? What does that look like for a math guy to use my skill set, which is not Photoshop, to improve this website? So I went online and started looking at other websites, right? So this is one I found. This is a data science product. I thought, okay, I can do something like this. This is from a restaurant review website. I guess they review other things besides restaurants. But they released this heat map thing where I can pick a city, and Atlanta's not on there, so I picked San Francisco. Hey, Seattle made the list. That's good for y'all. And then you can pick a keyword, but you can't type in any word. They're curated per city, right? So if you pick Paris, like baguette comes up. But if you pick San Francisco, hipster comes up. And then you click it, and it colors a heat map in saying, oh, for our review data, all the reviews talking about hipsters are all in the Mission. So that's the Mission in San Francisco. And so looking at this, you kind of realize, okay, this actually doesn't improve my experience of the product, right? All it does is it sort of flexes analytics muscle that, hey, we have all this data, we've taken all this textual data and put it in a heat map to say, okay, people talked about hipsters, now I'm showing it back to you because we think it's cool, right? And they've in fact selected the words that I can play with to parrot back something to me that I kind of already knew to begin with. That's how they curate it. It's like, oh yeah, that's exactly where hipsters are, isn't that cool? So I didn't want to do this. This doesn't look like it improves the user experience of the product at all. This is more impressing maybe the press or someone before I go public. This is another example. It's from a famous professional social network. This was their big first data science project that sort of kicked off Data Science is Sexy a few years ago. So in this social network, there's me down here. I can visualize all my connections in a map, and they've graphed them in these clusters. This is probably using modularity maximization, which I talk about in my book. Yay! And so I can see, okay, I've got these people in orange. These are people I knew in Boston. I've got these people down here in green. These are people I worked with at Booz Allen. So I've got these different clusters. I already know why these clusters exist, right? I can just look at the graph and it's like, yeah, I worked with those people there, and I worked with those people there, and I went to school with those people there. So really all you're telling me is things I already know, and I can highlight someone's name and it gives me their name. So now I'm seeing their name twice. So it's really sexy looking, right? But when you get into it, it's not improving the product in any way. It just looks really good. It takes the data and just sort of parrots it back to you and tells you things you already know, but it does it in a sexy way. So if this isn't what I should be doing, I'll leave this kind of stuff to the designers. What should I be doing? So I thought, okay, well, if I can't find good examples, maybe I'll look at the tool set that's out there. Maybe if I look at tools or techniques, I'll get some insight into what I should be working on. So what does the big data science technology landscape look like? I'll just look at all the tools. I found this slide, which is a nightmare. But then there's version 2.0 of the nightmare. So this is version 2.0, and this is still a couple of years old, actually. I suspect it's getting even more crowded. It's like bubbles within bubbles within bubbles. So what I discovered is that most analytics teams do something like this, right? You start by hearing about some tools. Okay, we need to use Hadoop. We have to. I don't know why. We have to use Hadoop. Choose your tools first. You know a fraction of what's possible because you've seen some other website do something that involved a graph, or they wrote a blog post that was really cool. And then you just kind of flail about looking for something to do, right? And trying to figure out, what does this mean for me? And then in order to impress your boss, there's another step. You create an infographic, right? So this is the last step in analytics nirvana. You've collected some data in a new tool that you paid a lot of money for to save it there, even though your data wasn't that big and you probably could have put it in a SQL database. But now I'm going to create an infographic out of it to prove that it was all worth it and that I should keep my job. So what I would propose is there's another way to go about analytics. And it goes something like this. Know what's possible first. So find out what data you have available to you, both internally and externally, if there's some external data that has some bearing on your life. But most of the time it's going to be internal data, right? So, okay, I got these databases, these databases, these databases. Marge over there has a spreadsheet she rarely shares with anyone, but I could use that too. You know, kind of take a survey of all the things you have around the company. For Microsoft, that's going to be insane, but at least in your small world, what are the data sources you have at your disposal? What techniques could I possibly use, right? So a basic understanding of, okay, what's forecasting? How is that different from predictive modeling? How is that different from data mining? How is that different from optimization? So it's kind of a basic idea of, okay, these are the various things people do with data in order to solve problems, and then understanding some of the technologies, right? Like, oh, if I want to do predictive modeling, maybe I would use R. If I just want to do some basic data viz, maybe I would use, well, I could use R again, or Python, or maybe I could even use Excel and just draw a graph. So understanding various technologies. Once you have all that down, then identifying problems or opportunities, right? So talking with people for, okay, what do you guys need help with that data could possibly solve? And actually, these first 2 points are in conversation all the time, right? You should always be talking to people, learning what opportunities there are, and you should always be learning about new stuff, you know, new data sources you didn't know existed. Oh, that's a finance database I didn't know about. New technologies that are coming out, new techniques people are publishing. So that's kind of all in conversation and tension all the time. And then once you know, all right, we're going to solve this problem, this requires data, and we can solve it. Here's the data we're going to use. We're going to use these sources. Here's the technologies we're going to use, and here's the techniques we're going to use. And then you solve it. So it's sort of a problem-centric approach to data science, right? And this is actually why I wrote this book. So Data Smart, this book is really not sexy. Basically, I take the reader through a bunch of techniques that are sort of the bread and butter of analytics, data science, and I do it in Excel because that's a great place to learn them. It's very sort of tool agnostic. I mean, it is a tool, but you know, the data is always in your face, right? So you can say, these are the inputs, and I'm going to put them through this formula, and here are the outputs, versus using a programming language like R, Python, where you're just going to load up a library and the work is done for you. You never actually learned anything. So this book is just meant to teach you. It's kind of like a survey of all the different techniques at your disposal, and it doesn't just hammer on one. A lot of books out there seem to just think that artificial intelligence is going to solve everything. It's a really sexy technique right now, but there's a bunch of other techniques out there that are also very useful. Outlier detection is one where you could do artificial intelligence, or you could do some other kind of technique that would be unsupervised. So I try to take people through all of them. Okay, so that's my spiel on analytics and how it should be done within a company or within an analytics team or some part of the organization. I want to just give y'all some examples of what this looks like at MailChimp, so I'm not just kind of blowing smoke like this. We actually try to practice this basic philosophy. And the way I'm going to do this is just go through, we break up the data science team into sort of 4 things that we do. We deliver insights and capabilities. Insights is just basic analysis or research. So these might be one-off things where the result might be a report or a spreadsheet or a blog post, right? And then we build capabilities, which are tools. So these could be internal tools that other teams can use, or external tools that actually just become part of the application, right? And so a MailChimp customer could use one of these tools. So we do this internal and external stuff. So we do it for internal customers, which are essentially other teams. We act as an internal consultancy to other teams. And then we do it for external customers, which are our users that pay us money. And the way it generally breaks down for us is we spend about 20% of our time doing just basic insights and 80% of our time building tools. That's in part because tools are just more powerful. If I can build something for the application, that means that all of our users can do analytics, versus if I just do it as a one-off, then that one report gets created and that's it. Furthermore, we spend a lot of time on capabilities because they're just harder to build. Okay, so I'm just going to go we're just going to go left to right and top to bottom. So internal insights. I'll give you some examples. This is our customer support team. They're all in Atlanta. It's actually about half the company. These folks answer chat and email support, right? So users write in and say, hey, I'm having trouble syncing up my Shopify website with MailChimp. How do I make this happen? These folks are the people that are going to answer that question. And we're adding users very quickly. So in Q1, we added 200,000 new users. And this is actually the night shift logo. We now have a night shift, yay. We're hiring about one new support employee every day, which for a company that I started there less than 3 years ago, and we had 80 employees, now we're at about 300, so it's pretty rapid for us. It's been kind of a shock. But one of the things we're bumping up against is, okay, we're now at a size with 6 million customers where we have to do some kind of triage or sorting of who gets support when, what does that look like, right? And I think the easy way to do it would be to say, okay, we've got forever free accounts for very small users. So these would be people like, oh, I have a fantasy football league and I'm going to send a newsletter through MailChimp. They might use us. Should they get support in the same way that a paid user does? So that would be a very simple way to do it. Unfortunately, what we found in the data is that 40% of eventually paid users come into customer support before they pay us money, right? So if you just give a certain type of support or support faster for people who've already paid, you're missing a lot of people who would have paid you money. So how do we solve that problem? Well, one of the things we could do, you'll remember I'm in the insights section, I'm not in the modeling and tools section, right, of this presentation. I could just build a big AI model to predict paid customers. That's one way to go about this. In fact, it's something we toyed with to see how far we could get. This is a quote that I really like. This is from Robert Holt. He wrote a paper called Very Simple Classification Rules Perform Well on Most Commonly Used Data Sets. And the basic premise is that you can build a big AI model to do a lot of things, but single rules often perform very well. So what's a single rule? It's, okay, I have this data that comes in about this user. This user looks like this. They do this, they do this, they do this. I'm going to check one thing. And based on that one check, I'm going to say they're likely to pay us money. So that would be a single rule. Those actually perform very well, right? A lot of times people want to jump to the most complex thing they can do. But Holt's contention in this paper is that complexity must be justified. People never really think about the fact that they have to justify why they're using a really complex approach. And in fact, I think probably Holt was probably saying, oh, you got to justify it with better accuracy or something like that. You got to provide a ROC curve that shows, oh, wow, if we use this complex model, we get all these gains. You also need to justify the additional organizational complexity, right? I've worked at a lot of companies, especially as a consultant, where my job was just to build this really complex thing that the client had asked for. And the sad thing about that is that they'll often get these really complex things that they can tout as like, man, we got this space age model. The moment the consultants leave, it dies, right? Because no one else knows how to update it. They asked for too many buttons and knobs and then immediately forgot what they do, and no one wants to read the documentation. There's an organizational complexity you can introduce if your model is just unwieldy. I had to build one forecast model that included a standard deviation in it, and I had to describe to every single person who was going to use it what standard deviation was. And the moment I left, the model was mothballed, right? So when we think about these models at MailChimp, I have to think, okay, am I going to stick around for this paid free prediction? Or is this something I'm handing to someone else? Who is that person? How do they keep it up to date? In this particular case, the customer was just a developer and someone in support, right? And they were not going to be keeping any eyes on this. So we analyzed the data and found that, you know what? There actually is, it's actually not one rule, there are two rules I can hand you that do a really good job of ordering customers. One is when you sign up for a MailChimp account, what's your email address? Is the domain a free mail domain, or is the domain your own domain for your business? So is it a paid domain? If it's a free mail domain, you're less likely to ever pay us money. Second rule, do you have a list of email addresses to import into MailChimp? If you say no, or if you leave this question blank, you're really not likely to ever pay us money. Those two questions combined were really extremely powerful features. After those two questions, anything else we added to models helped, but wasn't nearly as powerful as those two features. So we just left it at that. We realized we could get a more accurate model by including a bunch of other things. You could go out to the domain of that person's email address and look at it and use built with to tell what technologies they built with, is their checkout process, yada. You could do all of these creative things, but who's going to keep that up to date? Did we think it had a chance of survival? If the answer is no, let's stick with the simple one. That's fine. People need to realize they're free to do that. Okay, another example of the basic insight that we created. Someone in support had to schedule everyone who's doing chat support, and they had to schedule when they would take their lunch break. That's where it says phasing. They're phasing out of chat. It's kind of sad. Some of these people are 0.5. That means they're half a person. It's because they were just hired and they're not fully trained, so they're counted as half a person, which is kind of depressing. But they all become full people eventually after they take enough chats. But this is very difficult for someone. This is actually kind of a classic operations research problem, to have demand coming along the bottom here. It's sort of a forecasted chat demand that comes out of a forecast model, and then you got to schedule when are people going to take their lunch breaks. They had all these rules like, if you take a lunch break, you should take it with someone else because you don't want to be lonely. So we thought, okay, well, why don't we just do this schedule for you, because we know the math behind it. It's a classic operations research problem. Looks like this. It's actually just a bunch of inequalities, and then you've got an objective function. In our case, the objective function is maximize availability subject to demand. Code it up in LP format, which looks like this, which is frightening. Don't look at that too closely. And just return to them a schedule back in Excel, just how they wanted it. It just says, okay, here's when people are on point. That means they're taking chats. Here's when they're taking their lunch breaks. Certain days they're on email. And that's it. So this is an example where we found that someone was doing something the manual way, right? They were just kind of playing with people, okay, what if I slide their lunch break? And we realized, okay, we know how to do this with math. This actually isn't a big data problem. And we can just do it real quick and just hand you back this artifact, this spreadsheet that's actually optimal in terms of forecasted chat demand. So one thing I like to keep in mind while we're still on this topic is the Kobayashi Maru example from Star Trek, where Kirk has a test he has to take, and this particular test is unbeatable. I think the story actually changes in the new Star Trek movie versus the old Star Trek, but the basic idea is that there are these Klingon warbirds, and they're coming in, and they're going to destroy you, and you actually can't win. The point of the test is to kind of see how you do under pressure, given that you will fail. And Kirk actually goes in and changes the rules of the game, right? So he actually goes into the system and changes it and cheats so that he can win, because he refuses to admit defeat. He's just like that. Instead, he eats an apple and wins. But this is something to keep in mind as an analytics person, because I think the tendency is to be presented with a very complex game or system and be like, ooh, I can solve it with math and data. And you need people to go to lunch together so they're not lonely. Yeah, absolutely. But I think that analysts need to feel empowered to also say, you know what? Maybe we don't need to do that anymore. Like, it is perfectly acceptable to win some sort of analytics problem by suggesting to the business that maybe you should no longer do that at all, right? And the nice thing that analysts have and that data scientists have is this ability to take in the data, describe the problem, model it, and say, okay, what happens if we get rid of that rule, right? So what happens if I get rid of this rule that people have to go to lunch together? Does that somehow make us more available to take chats? And if so, by how much, right? So it's okay to change the rules of the game. And it's really nice when you can quantify what that change brings the business in terms of some kind of revenue or cost savings or what is it. So keep that in mind. Okay, external insights. We'll go through this one really quickly. These are basically blog posts, guides, things like that, right? So a bunch of our users want to know, hey, what are the demographics of some of these free mail providers? So how does Hotmail compare with Yahoo, AOL, Gmail? We've got Comcast on here because we actually send a ton of email to Comcast. They're not free mail. Interestingly enough, this is just there's a lot of analysis we did, but this is one graph I just stole out of the post. This is age distribution. So these are first quartile, median, third quartile age for various email providers. Comcast is way older. which is kind of interesting, and it's because you have to have like at least a couple bucks to have a Comcast email address, right? Because I got to have cable or internet or something. And then you'll see AOL actually slides out, about 6-7 years past Hotmail and Gmail, so that's kind of interesting. Hotmail's pretty young. I suspect some of this has to do with the fact that I need an email address in order to have an Xbox Live account. When I'm setting that up, it's going to be Hotmail, a bunch of Microsoft-owned free mail providers that are suggested. So we see that those age ranges, Hotmail and Gmail, are actually very close to each other. Yahoo's a little bit older. So that's just one sort of thing that we did and provided that to our users. We have a bunch of blog posts like this. And our users will get concerned about a few things. So a lot of people send email to Gmail. This is my Gmail account here. Gmail introduced a new promotions tab, right? So they took a lot of email marketing and put it on this separate tab. And so people were flipping out, like, what? My email's in another tab. What does that mean? Are people ever going to read my email again? Right? So we were actually able to do analysis and find out what exactly it meant, because there's nothing to be gained by hiding any of this from folks, right? Rather than letting the question fester, what the data science team can do is actually go into the data and just quantify, like, okay, here's what the change actually did. So for Gmail email addresses, what we saw is these are typical click rates for weekend and weekday, the 3 weeks before the promotions tab was introduced, and then the 3 weeks after the promotions tab was introduced. So typical click rates during the week would be 13% for a newsletter. After promotions was introduced, it's down around 12%. So you lost about 1%, right? So it's not the end of the world, but it did get affected, right? And so we're able to just communicate that to the user. Here's about what is going to happen. Another example, during the government shutdown, people want to know what's going to happen to the engagement of email addresses who work for the government, right? So we were actually able to provide some of that analysis as soon as the government shutdown started happening. Okay, here's what we're seeing. If you're at the EPA or the SBA or HUD, no one's checking their email because they're not allowed. They're forbade by law. Some people are still cheating. You'll notice, like, technically no one from HUD should have been checking their email, and about 1/5 were. Versus the SEC, somehow they skated by with everyone still working, and we actually saw this is when the fall was ramping up, so there's going to be an increase in email traffic, and we should see actually an increased engagement, which is why, as a percentage of before the shutdown, it's actually above 100% for SEC and State Department. So we were able to provide this to people so they knew, okay, if I'm in the mortgage industry, if I'm sending a newsletter that people who work at HUD are going to read, yeah, I should expect that my engagement will fall off a cliff. That's normal. Well, as much as a government shutdown is normal, it's normal. So these are just things that we can provide to people. Okay, so now let's get into some of the fun stuff, which is building capabilities or tools. Let's give you some examples of these. I'm going to give an example from compliance. We have a team that shuts users down. And the reason why they do this is because we have 6 million users. We don't have 6 million IP addresses that we send email over. So a lot of our users share an IP address. There's some really good averaging effects that come from that. But if you get one really terrible user in there who's sending to a lot of dead mailboxes, people who haven't checked their mail for 10 years, it's going to get noticed, and that IP address could be blocked, right? So we need to shut those users down very quickly. So one of the things I looked at when I first joined MailChimp is who's getting shut down, right? And for what reasons? And I went through all the reasons and created kind of this flow chart. Okay, you can get shut down for multiple accounts. You can get shut down for sending you a bunch of dead addresses. And then you can go through various processes, and either you're going to be kicked out the door permanently, you're going to go make some restitution, have a good list to send to that. But one thing I noticed, I don't know if you can read it in the back, so I'll read it for you. About 1/6 of our users were shut down for loading a large list of email addresses, trying to buy a high dollar account, or requesting high volume approval, i.e. approval to send to a large list. None of those things are bad, right? They're just scary. If I've got a user who comes in and is like, I want to send to 2 million people, we're going to shut you down and be like, why do you want to send to 2 million people? Because if we let that mail out the door and they're an abuser, that's a really terrible situation, right? So we're going to manually review them. But people have this expectation when they sign up for an online service that they shouldn't be slowed down, right? That things should happen seamlessly. We get a lot of letters like this, bullshit review process, I'm sending out high press releases is in all caps, I don't know. It's got yada, 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 this was a pain in the ass. People get really angry. And I understand. When I sign up for any account, I expect online that's kind of work really quickly. It's email, it's just I should sign up and be able to send. They don't realize that spam is something that is sort of originated with email, right? It's a big problem, and it's one we have to control for. And people are signing up like the day before Black Friday or something, right? So it's high potential for abuse, but they really want to get out their email today. People want to procrastinate. So how do we solve this problem? Well, we solve it instead of doing a manual review process. Can we create models that will predict when someone's going to abuse? And that's what we tried to do. This is a quote from Paul Graham about a decade ago. Basically, he says, oh, well, spammers, it's all about the content. They can't change their content. They can't get away from saying Viagra. They have to say Viagra. So long as I can detect Viagra, I can shut them down. This is actually wrong these days, right? Most of our abusers look like this. This is an email that I personally got. I did not sign up for this list. Dear Avondale Estates resident, I'm a realtor, yada, 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 welcome to the neighborhood, whatever. I never signed up for this. So there's some ways that this person might be within the law, might be within CAN spam if they provide certain information at the bottom of how to unsubscribe, etc. But from a MailChimp perspective, this is non-permission-based email. We would consider this person a spammer. They just got my email address from the city and blasted something at me. But there's nothing in the content that would allow me, as let's say an AI model, to necessarily know this is a spammer. There are good real estate agents out there that only send to actual customers. So how do we tell the difference? Well, spam is in the eye of the beholder, right? We tell the difference because it's the people on your list that are either going to open and click the email or they're going to hit the spam button, right? And that's the signal we're going after. So really, it's not about content at all. It's about your list. Who are these email addresses that you're about to send this to? Where have I seen them before? What types of stuff do they receive? How old are those email addresses? What happened the last time any one of our millions of users sent to them? We send to 3 billion email addresses currently, and we save all this data. So we were able to build a big system that looked at that, mostly list-based information as well as user-based information, a bit of campaign information. But the thing that we tried to focus on, and this goes back to the earlier slides at the beginning of the talk, is eliminating risk and complexity, right? Even when we build a production system and we deem this one important enough to actually build a full-fledged AI model instead of just a simple rule, we want to make sure that we design it in such a way that it's going to survive, right? So most of the data we used internally was already structured. So rather than using some unstructured database, like a Hadoop or Mongo, we just chose to use Postgres because our data is already structured. So why not just use a sharded SQL database for it? So we made a lot of design decisions like that. We used random forest as our AI model. I talk about that one in the book, because that one's actually particularly hard to overtrain. It's pretty robust against that. It's not very finicky. It's a pretty good one to use. So we just made decisions that would be slightly more robust. Okay, but let's talk about building tools for external users, right? When I talk about building an AI system, that's something that's internal. It can be fairly complex. I'm around to explain it to my coworkers in person. What does it look like to do analytics where the customer is someone on the other side of the world, right? And they're paying me maybe $15 a month. How do I build a tool for them? This is very hard, not only because tools are hard to build, but they're also hard to communicate, right? Data science tool is. So we like to keep it simple. This is probably my favorite thing I've gotten to work on. We have this CAPTCHA you have to fill out when you create an account with us. And this is a nightmare, right? I mean, I don't know at what point Google decided that we were going to start labeling all the addresses in the world for them. I assume this is a street address. This like black blob is probably a street address, but I never know the answer to these things. I think, on average, I'm at least failing the first one. So can we just get rid of it? That was the question. Can we use our data to get rid of it? And in fact, what we found is that for certain email addresses during the sign-up process, we could use our anti-abuse models we'd already built and all the data we were already saving in a large database called the Email Genome Project. We actually have data about 3 billion email addresses that we're constantly updating based on their interactions with the system. We could bring that data to bear on this question. There are certain email addresses, certain people who are signing up for an account where I just don't know, or it's a gray area. You're going to fill a CAPTCHA. but there's a large portion of our user base for which we never have to show this. So we removed it from the account sign-up process, and we removed it from the process where you contact customer support. So the artifact for this project for me, how do I build a tool? If we think about, it's really hard to communicate data science to people, there's just nothing, right? We just removed something from the application, and that's it. That's all we did. And so I was really happy about that because I didn't make anyone's life any harder. All I did was remove a barrier, and I took great joy in that. So another example, send time optimization. A really nagging question for our users is, when do I send my email marketing, right? They just get sort of hung up on it. They would spend all this time creating this newsletter about some sale they're about to have. They have maybe 1 million customers they're going to send it to, and they just don't know when to send it. And they start freaking out. And then they start going online and reading anecdotes from people they generally have guru in their job title, and they have no idea what they're talking about. Maybe they have some small set of data from one client they worked with, and they're like, people work from 9 to 5, and they always take their lunch break at noon, and they're always stuck in traffic at 6, so you don't want to send at noon or 6, and it's just always baloney. So could we answer this question for people? Well, this is the graph of for one individual email address, I've got some time slots here, sends versus clicks, right? And what are we really interested in? We're interested in when are people engaging with their email, and that engagement is not being driven necessarily by the notification they just got that they received the email, right? So where can I find engagement that's not tied to volume, but rather is, you were available, and you went back and you checked your email. So we built an optimization model off of that data. Here's actually some distributions of optimal send times for email addresses by category. So we've got college-age folks, folks in their 40s, and folks over retirement. And if we look at the distribution of optimal send times, we'll actually see that college pushes out to the right. So it peaks with most email addresses in college have an optimal send time around 1 p.m. versus folks in their 40s and after retirement, it's more around 10 a.m. So it's really interesting that the data actually bore that out. And we see similar trends for a lot of stuff. Bartenders, closer to 1 p.m. Neonatal nurses, there really is no peak. They're kind of checking their email throughout the day because their schedules are just weird. So we built this system, but it's got tons of data in it. It looks at data on an individual level. It's all stored in Redis. It's really sophisticated. How are we going to show this to our users? Well, they care about the optimal send time for their list. When they go through the campaign setup process, they have to pick a time to send at if they want to schedule their campaign. We just have a bubble there that says, let MailChimp pick, and then a little checkbox that says the optimal time to send is 3 p.m. So we did all this work, but that doesn't mean I have to build like a big graph with lots of colors and a heat map or anything like that to communicate that work, right? That's not for our users, that would be for the press. So instead, if you want to make the user experience better, let's just make it a simple bubble. That's enough, right? Here's another example. I'm just loading up examples here. Apologies. What if I have a list and there's a particular segment I'm really interested in, but I don't know all those people, right? So let's say MailChimp has a list of 5 million email addresses of people that have asked to be updated on our app and new things we're releasing. So let's say I want to find the press in there, the tech press. And I know a few of the email addresses, like, I know that person who works for ReadWriteWeb. I know that person who works for, some tech blog, TechCrunch. But I don't know all of the press that's on my list. How am I going to find them? Well, chances are, based on their data, their subscription data, how they interact with our system, other people in the press live in their neighborhood in sort of a data neighborhood sense, right? So they're subscribing to the same things, they're interacting with the same things. So what do I really want to know? I want to know who lives as close to the tech people, the tech writers I know, who lives as close to them as they live to each other. So we can do that calculation, but how do we expose it within the system? You go into the Create a Segment tab here, and you put in some email addresses of people we know. I know this person Ars Technica, I know this person All Things D. These are people on my list, right? And I just want to find the other people on my list I might not be aware of. All we did was we created a Discover Similar Segments button. So you can either save this segment, or you can save this segment with some other people who look like them. And that's it. It's just a button. So that's really the approach we take. We work hard to build these systems that are very rigorous, but we try to keep things as simple as possible, right? If we can keep the math simple, we keep the math simple. If the math has to be complex, we try to make sure that The way it's exposed to people, the way that it's kept up is still simple. And so I'll just leave you with 4 points, really. I think anyone who's doing data analysis at any company, it's important that you align yourself with the goals of the business and serve your colleagues, right? You see a lot of articles these days about like, oh, data science is the sexiest job. I don't know. Just align yourself with everyone else and serve, and that way when all the hype dies, people see that you're valuable and just want to keep you around. Data science products should receive no special treatment, right? So if a designer can solve a problem that I can solve by just changing the color of a button or making the app look different or feel different, that is fine, right? There's nothing special necessarily about using math versus something else. So if something's not working, feel free to kill it. Get a goal first and then get toys, right? Don't just flail about. Figure out exactly what you want to do and then figure out, okay, here's the toys, here are the tools that are going to solve that problem. And avoid complexity. That's really what I've talked about for 30 minutes now. So that's it. If y'all have questions, I think we have time for questions, right? Yes.
You mentioned about the email genome project, right? Is it open to all of us? I mean, can we access the metadata about different users?
It's not. So that's the short answer of that. We're still trying to, we're going really slowly with it. There are a few companies out there that are sort of charging around like a bull in a china shop related to data like this, and they're getting huge trouble. We've always erred on the side of privacy, and these systems were built, first things first, to prevent abuse, right? So we have tons of data on billions of email addresses, but I don't know. We've always tried to figure out how can we share, what can we share in a way that maintains expectations from recipients, expectations from our users. So stuff like Discover Similar Segments, it's powered by EGP. However, it's only about stuff on their list, right? We might use that 3 billion email address data set to perform these neighborhood calculations, but all I'm telling you is you have these email addresses on your list. These are email addresses like them also on your list. So everyone's double opted in, everything's above board, so we don't really share any of that right now. Yes?
What is your educational background?
So my background is, I did pure math in undergrad, so I studied like abstract algebra and stuff, and then my advisor sat me down and said, "You're not going to be a great mathematician." His words were actually something like, "You could go to an okay grad school, but you're gonna be one of those guys that's kind of like toys around with small results for the rest of your life, and math will jump forward really quickly at certain points by geniuses, and you'll just kind of be toying around. But if you're cool with that and you really like this, keep doing it." I said, "That sounds like that sucks. I'm going to get a job." So I went to grad school in applied math, operations research, and did that instead. And then my wife got pregnant. It's like, well, now I really need a job. So I worked for the government for a while. My problem with the government is that some of the folks you interact with just really want to retire. Where I like things that are exciting, and I just ran into problems with people just kind of like, there was one person I was interacting with who had a picture of a golf course above their desk. He's like, "Yeah, I'm going to be there next year when I retire, and I'm not doing anything until then." And it's just really rough. I'm sure there are other government organizations where that's not true. That was true for me. So I got out of there. But that's sort of my background. Yes?
You talked a lot about, for instance, one of your examples with the email, the subject or the content of the email being the primary predictor versus the recipients, but it seemed as though the recipients were largely based on ancillary data about the recipients, whereas the intrinsic data to the email itself, the only thing really there is the subject plus some names that you don't know anything about.
Right.
So the question, which I should have gotten to much quicker, is how do you think about the data neighborhood of a person? Is it more important to get the data to understand the neighborhood, or is it more important to get the toys, tools, and analysis to analyze what you do have? So if you were looking at emails alone with no further context, how far could you get with analytic tools and processes versus ancillary data collection and understanding the connections between multiple
You're right. Yeah, that becomes extremely important, right? So in order to have that abuse model work, the main predictors are built on the list, right? So it's when we think about an email sent through MailChimp, it's really this huge payload that's the content, and then the list of email addresses, and then there's your user metadata. So you're geolocated here, you say your business address is here because you have to provide a real address for canned spam, and then your billing address is here and you're paying with Diners Club, we'll look at all that too. But with the email addresses, you're right. We can get some stuff just from the list, just as it is, right? So, why is your list 100% Gmail and all in caps? Why is everything like admin at or DBA at? That would be like really scary because they're all role addresses. But usually we have to connect it up, right? So we want to go into EGP and we've got to have tools to do this. We want to go in and say, okay, where have we seen these email addresses before? How many of them were involved in the Sony hack? How many of them have been made public? How many of them do we think are journalists? Why are you emailing 80% journalists? That seems scary. We'll look at all sorts of stuff like that. How many of them are verifiably dead, right? So the last time they were sent to, they had, the inbox is dead. Or how many of them have soft bounced a gazillion times in a row, meaning they're on vacation permanently as far as we're concerned. In order to understand all that, you got to have this big network of everything. And also subscription data, right? You get some lists where it's extremely broad, and then other lists where it's like, it's all, maybe women in their 20s, and that's it. So if what does it mean that you're sending to a huge group of these people when your content is kind of odd, or you're geolocated halfway around the world and you're sending a different language? So yeah, we have to consider that whole thing, and yeah, we had to get all sorts of tools and techniques that would help us, look at that much data. Yes.
Seems like you're getting good results from all the networks you've built up and all the routes that you guys have. Just going back in time, when you first started MailChimp, you had a fewer set of users. Was there heavier reliance on external data sources to answer some of those problems, or how did you reconcile that as the company grew?
It never really factored in until, so the company is quite small until we introduced our free plan, right? And then it exploded. It's kind of like free marketing. And one of the great things about free users is, okay, they're essentially a marketing cost, but they provide all this data that can be used to facilitate building these tools, which helps keep the ecosystem clean for everybody. I came around after the free account, because before it, there wasn't really enough data to do this kind of analysis. And because there wasn't enough data, people just didn't focus on it at all, just didn't even try. And so once we had all the data lying around, it was like, well, we could just operate as we always have, just charge for accounts, which is what we do, and just keep growing, and that's fine. But they just wanted to make use of this, and abuse was really one of the main things that catalyzed it. Because if you have a free plan, you're going to get abusers who are like, oh yeah, it's just write a bot to sign up for free accounts. So they have to bring in someone like me to solve that problem, but then you get to do all these other fun things with the data. There's a question online.
So Ani says, how do you design software with data first? As in, is there a different way to think about designing a website if I want to collect all this data to model, analyze later?
So yeah, there's a tension there, right? Like, we try to design MailChimp in a way that just provides a really fun experience for folks. If you've never used the website, like, before you send an email campaign, a little monkey's hand comes down above this big red button, and it's kind of shaking and sweat's dropping off it. And it's really fun. If you start thinking about, oh, I want to collect this data and that data, all of a sudden the user experience is degraded, right? So recently I logged into Facebook and it was like, do you work here or here or here? And it's like, why would you even think that I worked for Mary Kay? Like, I don't understand. What did I say that made you think that? And how do I get past this screen, right? So there's this tension with, if I want to collect data and use it to then have some feedback loop where I get better products, is that going to get in the way of the thing I want, which is a better product? So we try to find ways to not bug people, right? Yes?
To find ways not to bug people, do you have to deal with uncertainty and ambiguity in your models? So instead of knowing for certain that person works at Mary Kay, you say, I have a guess that they might?
Yeah, and I think that that's actually really good to keep that humility in mind all the time, right? Like Shutterfly recently sent an email campaign to a bunch of people saying, congratulations on your new baby. And a lot of those people did not have a new baby, right? They thought that their data was correct. and in fact, it's often not correct. So we tried to build tools that will never get us into that situation, and so it's kind of nice when you sort of never in a situation where like, oh yeah, we know that for sure, because you're most of the time you're wrong. Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for the simplicity of your book. I had just picked up from the front desk a book on foundations for predictive analytics, because it had words like foundations and practical and simple, and on page 10, that's the math. And this is the second book. The first one was Predictive Analytics for Dummies, and it was the same thing. Nowhere to start by saying, hey, I have 2 data points and I want to predict the third. And if you do that, you can do that, but here's the limitations of it. So here's how you want to get around that. And then another example. And that sounds like that's what you're.
Yeah, I mean that's why I chose Excel. A lot of books do choose to go like, all right, we're going to do some mathematical notation written in LaTeX first, and it's got Greek symbols like the sigma and stuff. Like we're going to do a sum, and they just kind of assume not only that people know how to read that, but if they don't, like they're going to explain it, and that people would even want to read it. And I think that Excel is really nice because it's this language people will kind of already get because they've had to like, oh, I got to do a sum, I'm going to equal sum, and then drag through this range. You kind of already know that, and so yeah, I'm tired of reading. I like that kind of stuff to a degree, but at some you just get sick of it after a while. Sometimes you just want something that's a little bit different. So
well, if you have an operations research background, it's an option for you, but for those of us that don't,
right,
we don't have that option.
Right, and I think if you're in school, this is like your job, is to read this stuff. But if you're working another job, you kind of want to get to the chase a little faster, and that's fine. Other questions? Yes?
The big user experience story of last year was the rollout of the Obamacare webpage. Can you comment?
The A/B testing they did? The significant A/B testing they did around
No,
that?
the Obamacare rollout.
Oh, that actually, just the website falling over?
Yes.
I mean, what I can say about that was having worked in government and worked in consulting, when I heard that was happening, I was like, yeah, of course, right? I mean, it was so many contractors all working on little pieces of it and then smashing it together, and the whole government contracting apparatus is set up for failure, right? I mean, like, you look at that and then you look at, what is it, the F-35 that's also having problems and things like, these things, it's hard. I feel bad for the government sometimes. Working at MailChimp is so much nicer because it's like we can do things soup to nuts really quickly, and it's not like we were building a camel for 4 years and then releasing it and hoping it works. Yes?
You emphasized the importance of reducing complexity and also clear communication. From your presentation, I mean that there's at least 2 important metrics that you look at, which is the number of emails sent and the number of clicks. At the same time, with MailChimp, if I understand correctly, people can build arbitrary emails and surveys. There's an infinite number of content that they can produce. So can you walk us through how do you take this fairly complex product, or a product that enables people to reach complex applications, and distill that to a number of clear metrics that you can track and make decisions and also clearly communicate to others?
The whole metrics question is kind of funny because I work in a company that is almost vehemently anti-metric. So for instance, we did a marketing campaign recently where we took out a bunch of billboards in various cities across the US, and they just had the Freddy head, our little MailChimp logo, and no text on them whatsoever. So the only people who even understand what these billboards were people who were already customers, right? And there was no data gathering around, how did you hear about us? Did you see the billboard when you signed up? Nothing. It was just to make our current users a little happier. They would take pictures, they would tweet. And so, I mean, I guess that's kind of a metric. Did we see any pictures on Twitter of the billboard today? When we took the one down in Chicago, there was the local paper wrote an article about how sad someone was across the street from the billboard that the monkey was gone. He's like, I don't know what I'm going to do anymore. And it was all facetious. It was like an Onion article, but it was great. So, one of the ways that we handle metrics is we just blatantly ignore them. And then we do a lot of other things. Like we do just a lot of customer interviews, right? So a lot of what we would do would be, rather than looking at like, well, what's our ARPU? What's our ARPU recently? Are we, all these weird metrics that you can sort of design around, you think they're somehow related to the success of your company or to revenue, but then you end up gaming them, right? So then you end up saying, okay, I want to increase average revenue per user, so I'm going to do that by increasing wait times and support for users who don't pay us as much and making them pissed and then they leave. And now all of a sudden my average has gone up because I've just gotten rid of a bunch of users. So we just seem to ignore stuff like that, talk to our customers just very closely and don't track a lot of things like that, but instead talk to our customers closely, understand what they want. Are we hearing enough of the same thing, enough of the same stories? And that's a lot of what the UX team does. They do a lot of in-person videoed stuff. They also do a lot of surveys. And then we'll build things off of those, right? So we'll say, okay, people really, this is really the problem they're having. They say they want this, but we've videoed them, we've watched what they do, and they're really bumping them, stuff like this. You can't ignore that sort of basic insight that may not actually come from data. It comes from watching people. We take that and we build tools off of that too. So that's a lot of the end run we do around tracking website metrics. We just don't. So, yes?
You mentioned talking to users. How does your organization go about talking to users, and who is it that actually does it?
It is the UX team that does it. So we have a large team at MailChimp that's the user experience team. The data science team works very closely with them. Essentially, the way it works is that they're sort of a small yappy dog that can sense threats real quickly and run around and claw at like the glass screen door and be like, and then we're like a really fat, slow dog that can do things that are really frightening, but it takes us forever to get started up. So they'll start yapping and they'll wake us up and they'll wander and be like, all right, what are we building for y'all? But they do a lot of in-person customer interviews all around the world. Some of those customers would be sort of bleeding edge, using us in really creative ways. Other customers would be just more of our standard customers. Maybe it's a mom and pop shop trying to sell something and they've realized, oh, a mailing list is really useful. And they'll go out and they'll actually video those. They'll watch people using the website. So they do a lot of that. They also do a lot of surveys, and that's how they find people who are at least a little bit engaged, right? I mean, you filled out the survey, you filled out the comment section, like, I really wish you guys did this. So they would find people that way too. So yeah, they do all of that. And then actually we've started just recently sending one data scientist with them. So the data science team at MailChimp, we tend to hire former consultants. I don't know if that's just because I like former consultants because I was one, but we want people who just in general can talk to folks. So there's no fear of letting the data scientist out of the closet. Like, it is perfectly acceptable to send someone with a math background to talk to a customer. And so they'll hang out as a fly on the wall, and then once data comes up or science comes up, they'll be like, oh yeah, can I ask you some more questions about A/B testing, how to use it, yada, yada, yada. And they'll come back with ideas like, oh, we should really try this. And that's really nice, because if you wait for other people who don't understand what you do to translate it, sometimes stuff gets lost in translation, right? I mean, the best translation occurs inside of one brain. So yeah, it's a bit about that. Yes?
So you mentioned that in your organization you have a central data science team and many other teams operating around it. How do you guys scale up when it comes to, say, having different departments pool in a lot of requests, bombard you with a huge queue? How do you work around that?
Well, the CEO helps prioritize that, for one. Another great technique we use is we let people submit requests and we wait 2 days. And we see which ones survive. It's amazing the number of requests people give you that the next day people are like, oh, I don't need that anymore. It's like, okay, good. But we actually generally prioritize based on we have broader conversations with managers, find out what are the main goals for the year for the company. Okay, this year we're thinking about, I can't tell you what they are because they're secret, but we're thinking about these 3 things. Which of these products that we could work on will help us achieve those 3 high-level goals? And we tackle those first. And we never have enough time, so it's never like we get to a point where we clean off the list. Some stuff just gets too old and dies. Yes?
So when you started the email genome project and you had no data to start with, how did you decide what to put into your database? Just grab everything, or how did you go about that?
Well, we started with particular products in mind we were going to build first. And so we knew the first product we were going to build was this abuse prediction model, right? And so we knew we wanted mailbox interaction data in order to build that. Like, I need to know about bounces, dead mailboxes, things like that, spam bounces, all that stuff. So that's just going to be first, right? And so some of those data sets, I mean, that one's actually huge, right? Because we send 10 billion emails every month. all those emails are going to get some response back from the server saying, yeah, we've accepted it. Or in the case of certain email products, they might say, yeah, we've accepted it. And then 2 days later, they'll send you a bounce like, ha, we didn't actually accept it. So we got to grab all that. So we started with that. So for us, it's always been about what's the next thing we're going to build. And let's make sure that we start, 6 months out planning how that data is going to enter into EGP. There are other people tackle that in other ways. I'm a little bit not optimistic about people like, let's just get everything first and then figure out what we're going to build. And so they spend years capturing data and have no idea what they're going to do with it until it's all in there. Yes?
Can you comment a bit on the data integrity of some of the predictions you make? Like in the example which you talked about the email, you say, okay, from the bunch of those 4 emails, you can predict that this email address is also a tech journalist or something. How do you correlate and how do you do a data integration on that?
The one where we've looked a lot at accuracy would be the anti-abuse stuff, because we really care that we're only shutting down bad people. And so for that one, what I can say is that there is a portion of people, probably 10% of users, that are a gray area, right? We can tune the model such that we are extremely accurate for all these abusers and all these good people. And the cool thing there is if you're predicted good, verifiably good, we just never talk to you. You just sail straight through, which is awesome. But there is this portion in the middle that's gray. So that would be one place where we found that. And then the cool thing is this doesn't end at the research paper somebody was published. Like, oh, this is how accurate we got. Instead, what we did is we figured out how do we handle the gray people. And the way we do that is through taste testing. So we essentially say, hey, unfortunately, this model has detected that you could be good, you could be bad. Here's why. What we're going to do is we're going to take your list, we're going to send out a taste test first. So we're going to send out this many email addresses, we're going to wait 1 hour. We're going to see what kind of feedback comes in, and now we're not in the realm of prediction anymore, right? Now we're in the realm of, this is reality. If you pass, then the rest of your campaign goes out. So we've essentially mitigated some of our risk. It provides a slightly diminished user experience to that gray area, but we found that it's necessary. We can't just assume the gray area is bad, and we can't assume they're good either. So that's sort of the middle ground. But yeah, so we do analyze how well we're doing. That's part of what we do. Yes?
Time for one more.
One more. Congratulations.
So you mentioned about the questions that you would answer can be answered by the data science team or the UX team. Or sometimes can be both. So what is the process about how do you decide a particular question is to be answered by, let's say, data science versus UX? Like we are kind of in a similar boat where we call it an objective way to collect things versus subjective way of collecting things, but I would like to hear your opinion.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a matter of priorities and whether we think there's additional gains to be made out of not just doing like the basic UX stuff. Like, oh yeah, if we can just do a few interviews, look at our survey data. Maybe it's a few SQL queries that even someone on the UX team could do. Yeah, just let them handle it. If it becomes a situation, there's no formal process. It's a small company, right? 280 folks, half of those are in customer support. So if you just look at people doing operational stuff, it's actually very small. We just talk to each other, and eventually the UX team will just say, like, hey, this is above our mathematical pay grade, and it's very important too. If everyone says this is really important and needs to be worked on, the data science team's quite small, but you guys handle this one because we can't crack it with our data. And the finance team will do that too, right? They have databases they look at, but sometimes they'll be like, hey, I really have this question around international users. It's beyond us. We have to go to content. We need to make sure we understand the language content's written in, yada, yada, yada. All of a sudden, that becomes a data science question. And so it'll just end up in our court. And then if the CEO thinks we should do it, we just do it, regardless. That always breaks the tie. All right. Thanks, y'all. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.